Before I begin, I have a very important request to make. If you believe in God's power and want to grow in your faith, leave your amen in the comments and subscribe to receive God's message every day. Did you know that most people who watch the videos are not subscribed? This means you might be missing out on transformative and powerful content. Don't let that happen. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to make sure you don't miss any powerful message that God has for your life. God has the power to turn even the deepest stigmas of life into powerful testimonies of faith and redemption. Just like Jephthah, we are often placed in difficult situations, feeling worthless. But it is precisely in those circumstances that God reveals His mercy, His divine love, and His ability to act in our lives. Today, as you watch, know that it doesn't matter where you come from or what labels the world has placed on you. God has something greater for your life. Jefthah's transformation didn't come from the acceptance of others, but because he placed his faith in God's power, and He used him for great miracles. Stay with me until the end, because I will share how Jefthah's story brings a powerful revelation on how you can overcome rejection and find your true identity in Christ. Don't miss this powerful moment. If you believe that God can transform your life, subscribe now to make sure you don't miss upcoming content filled with wisdom and grace. Birthmarked by stigma. Jephtah was born on a quiet night in Gilead, but his birth was not what many might consider a blessing. His father Gilead had an extramarital affair with a prostitute, resulting in a child seen by many as the product of sin and error. This stigma hung over Jephtah from the moment he came into the world. In a society where one's value was often determined by lineage, he was not accepted as a legitimate member of the family. His birth did not bring joy, but rejection, and he grew up with the awareness that he was an outsider among his half-brothers, with no right to the inheritance that his name and lineage could have given him. The divine love that would later manifest in his life was far from apparent, and God's forgiveness seemed like a distant concept to those around him. It's interesting how often a person's life begins marked by rejection and difficulties, but that doesn't define their end. Jephtah, though rejected by his half-brothers and marginalized by society, was never invisible to God. While people may have the power to reject, God never rejects us. Jesus, in his life, was often rejected, but that never stopped him from fulfilling his mission. According to Scripture in John 1:11, he came to what was his own, and his own did not receive him. Even Jesus, the Son of God, experienced rejection, and this rejection didn't deter him from his purpose. The key takeaway is that no matter the stigma others place on us, God's plan for us transcends earthly judgment. Just as Jesus carried the burden of rejection but still moved forward in faith, so too did Jephtah, unknowingly on a path to greatness that was already written by the hand of the divine. Rejection often serves as the precursor to a deeper understanding of faith and resilience. God uses moments of humiliation and isolation to prepare us for the greater purposes He has for us. Just look at the stories of the Bible. Joseph, sold by his brothers, was rejected and abandoned, yet it was through his suffering that he became a ruler in Egypt, a man of great wisdom. Similarly, Jephtah's beginning wasn't one of honor or acceptance, but it was exactly this rejection that set the stage for his rise. The Bible teaches us that God's plans are often hidden in moments of darkness. Sometimes it takes walking through rejection to be prepared for the great blessings that await us in His divine timing. Jephtah's life, though beginning in rejection, was moving toward a purpose that no one could foresee: rejection and expulsion from home. Jephtah's life was a series of trials that began with his birth, and the rejection didn't stop there. Growing up in a household where he was seen as illegitimate, Jephtah faced constant disdain from his half-brothers. They looked at him not as a sibling, but as an outsider, someone who had no place among them. The bitterness of being cast aside only deepened as he grew older. In a world where lineage and inheritance were paramount, Jephtah had none of the rights that his brothers enjoyed. His existence, in their eyes, was a reminder of their father's sin, and they wanted him out. Eventually, their cruelty reached its peak, and they cruelly expelled him from the family home, leaving him with nothing. With no place to call home, Jephthah was forced to leave Gilead and go to the land of Tob, a place of exile for those like him, rejected and forgotten by society. It's heartbreaking to consider how often rejection in this world is tied to things beyond our control. Just like Jephthah, many of us face circumstances we didn't choose. We're rejected by society, by our families, or even by the very people we thought we could trust. But here's the thing, God's love transcends all rejection. Look at Jesus, who was not only rejected by his own people, but also betrayed by those closest to him. In Matthew 26:56, the Bible tells us, "Then all the disciples left him and fled." Yet, in the midst of that betrayal, Jesus still fulfilled his divine purpose. His rejection didn't define him. It propelled him toward the redemption of humanity. Jephtah's expulsion from home, though painful, was part of a bigger plan that would lead him to his destiny. Sometimes, when we are rejected, we find ourselves walking through an unknown and difficult path, much like Jephthah did when he fled to Tob. Yet, in that very journey, we are being shaped and refined. God often uses times of exile, whether physical or emotional, to prepare us for a purpose far greater than we can imagine. The rejection Jephthah faced didn't define his future. It simply set him on the path to the fulfillment of God's greater plan. When we're faced with rejection, we must remember that God's love and plan for us are not hindered by the opinions or actions of others. Like Jephthah, we may feel alone at times, but we are never truly abandoned. God's mercy and grace are ever present, even in our darkest moments. Unexpected rise as a leader. In Tob, Jephtah's exile to Tob, a land far from his homeland, could have marked the end of his story. But as we know from countless examples in the Bible, God doesn't work within the limits of our expectations. Jephtah, though rejected and cast aside, found a new purpose in the land of Tob. Here, in this remote place, he encountered others who had also been rejected by society. Mercenaries, outcasts, and men with nowhere else to turn. Instead of wallowing in despair, Jephthah became a natural leader among them. His strength, resilience, and wisdom began to shine through. It wasn't by force or coercion that he rose to a position of leadership, but by his inner character, the qualities that God had been quietly developing in him during his time of hardship. His reputation spread, and soon the name of Jephthah, the son of the prostitute, became known far and wide, not for his shame, but for his courage and ability to lead. Isn't it powerful to think that God often uses the most unexpected people to rise up and lead? This theme of God, choosing the unlikely, is seen throughout the Bible. David, the youngest of his brothers, was overlooked by his own father, but was chosen by God to be king. In 1 Samuel 16:7, God told Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him." The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Jephtah's rise was not because of his status or birthright, but because of his heart and his trust in God. When we face adversity and rejection, we often feel as though we are unworthy of greatness. But God's view is different. He sees potential where others see nothing. When you face rejection, remember that God is cultivating something in you that others cannot see. Your calling, your purpose is not limited by the opinions or standards of the world. Jephtah's rise as a leader is a testament to the strength that can emerge from hardship. When life seems to push us to the margins, it can be easy to believe that we have no purpose left. But like Jephtah, we often find that it is in our moments of exile, loneliness, and rejection that we are most equipped to grow into the leaders God intends us to be. Just as Christ was prepared in the wilderness, tested and refined, so too was Jephtah. God does not waste our suffering. It is through these very trials that He forms the qualities within us that are necessary to fulfill His purpose. We may not always understand why we are placed in difficult circumstances, but God sees the bigger picture. Jefthah's journey was not about being forsaken. It was about becoming the man who would lead Israel to victory. Return to Gilead as last hope. As time passed, the land of Gilead found itself facing a dire threat. The Ammonites, a fierce and relentless enemy, began to encroach upon Israel, threatening to overtake the land and enslave its people. The leaders of Gilead, desperate and with no other options, realized they needed a strong leader to rise up and face the Ammonite threat. It was then that they, in a turn of fate, called upon Jefthah. The same men who had once rejected him, who had cast him out and left him to fend for himself in Tob, now saw him as their last hope. It must have been a bitter moment for Jefthah to be sought out by those who had once driven him away. But, understanding the gravity of the situation, he agreed to return to Gilead with one condition: that he would be made their leader after the victory. His heart was not seeking revenge or to prove his worth. It was to fulfill a purpose that had been placed on his life by God. This moment is a powerful reminder of how God's timing is always perfect. Often we are rejected or overlooked when it seems like our lives have no direction, but God's plan is far beyond our understanding. The very people who once turned their backs on Jefthah were now in desperate need of the wisdom, strength, and leadership that he had gained during his time of exile. This is a perfect example of how God prepares us, even in seasons of rejection and isolation, to step into positions of authority when the time is right. Just as Joseph was called to interpret Pharaoh's dream after being sold by his brothers, Jefthah was called back to Gilead at just the right moment. The psalmist reminds us in Psalm 75, 6-7, "No one from the east or the west or from the desert can exalt themselves. It is God who judges. He brings one down, he exalts another." God had been preparing Jefthah for this very moment, and he was ready to lead Israel to victory. Jefthah's return to Gilead teaches us that God's grace and mercy are ever present, even in the most surprising circumstances. The leaders of Gilead had turned to the one they had rejected, but in God's eyes, Jefthah had always been a part of his plan. It didn't matter what others thought or how they treated him. What mattered was that Jefthah was now walking in alignment with God's purpose. Sometimes, when we feel abandoned or overlooked, it can be easy to think that our journey is pointless or that God has forgotten us. But this story reminds us that, in God's timing, everything comes full circle. Our rejection is not the end of our story. Like Jefthah, when God calls us back to where we once felt excluded, it is often because He has been preparing us for something greater. We must trust His plan, knowing that His grace is sufficient and His timing is always perfect. Fatal promise to God. Before heading into battle against the Ammonites, Jefthah made a vow that would forever alter the course of his life. In a moment of desperation and fervent belief that God would deliver Israel from their enemies, Jefthah promised that, if God granted him victory, he would sacrifice whatever came out of his house first upon his return. This vow, made in the heat of the moment, was rash and impulsive, but it was made with sincerity. Jefthah had no way of knowing that the first to greet him upon his return would be his beloved daughter. But he had spoken his vow before God, and as the scriptures remind us in Ecclesiastes 5:4-5, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. Jefthah's promise was now a binding commitment, and it would have grave consequences. This moment calls to mind the importance of being careful with the promises we make to God. Though Jefthah's vow came from a place of faith, it was also a reflection of his limited understanding of the gravity of his words. We see this pattern throughout the Bible, where promises made in moments of desperation or excitement often lead to unexpected consequences. In Matthew 5:33-37, Jesus teaches us the importance of speaking wisely, saying, "Let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." Jefthah's vow, though made with the intention of honoring God, was made in haste and without full consideration of the consequences. It is a reminder for us to be thoughtful and prayerful before making commitments to God, especially when those commitments could have long-lasting effects. What's particularly striking about Jefthah's vow is the trust he placed in God. Even though the vow led to a tragic outcome, there's a lesson in faithfulness here. Jefthah had to face the brutal reality of his promise and follow through, no matter the personal cost. In this, he displayed a level of obedience and reverence for God that many would have struggled to uphold. It reminds us of the cost of following God and how sometimes the sacrifices we make in His name are not what we expect. As Romans 12:1 urges, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." Jefthah's journey was one of sacrifice, not just in the military victory he sought, but in the ultimate personal cost of fulfilling a vow to God. It serves as a powerful reminder that following God often requires us to make choices that are difficult but necessary to stay in alignment with His will. Overwhelming victory and tragic return. Jefthah's faith and leadership led Israel to an overwhelming victory against the Ammonites. With God's help, his army defeated the enemy forces, and the people of Gilead were spared from destruction. Jefthah's victory was not just a military triumph, but also a validation of his leadership. In the moment of what should have been joyous celebration, however, a tragic reality awaited him. As he returned home from battle, the first person to greet him was his beloved daughter, who ran out to meet him, dancing and singing in celebration of her father's victory. It was a bittersweet moment, for Jefthah had made a vow to God that the first thing to come out of his house would be sacrificed. In that instant, he realized that the fulfillment of his promise would cost him dearly. His daughter, innocent and unaware of the fate that awaited her, had become the very sacrifice he had vowed to offer to God. It is impossible to fathom the depth of the pain Jefthah must have felt in that moment. His victory, which should have been a moment of great joy for his people, was overshadowed by the personal cost of fulfilling his vow. This story serves as a reminder of the weight of the promises we make to God and the deep responsibility we have in honoring those promises. In the same way that Jesus was willing to sacrifice his life for us, Jefthah's promise required a sacrificial act that was both painful and final. The Bible teaches us in Luke 14:28-30 that we should carefully consider the cost of discipleship, saying, "Suppose one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it?" Jefthah's vow was made in haste, and though he was a man of great faith, the price of that vow was far higher than he could have imagined. Yet, in this tragic moment, we also see the obedience of Jefthah's daughter. When she learned of her father's vow, she did not resist or fight against it. Instead, she asked for 2 months to mourn her virginity in the mountains, knowing that she would never marry and fulfill the cultural role expected of her. Her acceptance of her fate speaks volumes about her faith and trust in God, even in the face of incomprehensible loss. Her story is a testament to the power of sacrifice and obedience, even when it means letting go of everything. In Hebrews 13:16, we are reminded, "And do not forget to do good and to share with others, for with such sacrifices God is pleased." The sacrifice made by Jefthah and his daughter was deeply painful, but it was also an act of honoring God's will, even when it came at the greatest cost, fulfilling the promise and the consequences. After the 2 months of mourning in the mountains, Jefthah returned to fulfill the promise he had made to God. His daughter, with a heart full of faith, had accepted her fate, understanding that her life would not follow the path she had once hoped for. She had been given a moment to grieve, to experience the depth of her sacrifice, but the reality was now upon them both. Jephthah, a man of great strength, was about to carry out the most painful act of his life. In obedience to God's law, Jephthah fulfilled his vow, and his daughter became the sacrifice that he had promised. The magnitude of this moment cannot be overstated. It was not just the loss of a child, but the fulfillment of a vow that carried with it a lifetime of grief and regret. Yet, despite the personal cost, Jefthah was determined to honor the vow he had made, showing his commitment to the Lord and his understanding of the weight of divine promises. This tragic fulfillment of Jefthah's vow serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of our words, particularly when they are made before God. Though Jefthah acted in good faith, believing his vow to be a sign of his devotion, it ultimately led to a personal loss that no victory could overshadow. The Bible is clear about the importance of keeping our promises to God, no matter the cost. In Numbers 32, we read, "When a man makes a vow to the Lord, or takes an oath to obligate himself by a pledge, he must not break his word but must do everything he said." Jefthah's actions show us that when we commit ourselves to God, our promises are not to be taken lightly. The consequences of our vows, whether they are spoken in moments of desperation or sincere faith, can be far-reaching. In Jefthah's case, his devotion to God required a sacrifice that would forever impact his life and the lives of those around him. In the aftermath of this sacrifice, we see the weight of the loss that Jefthah carried with him. Despite his victory, despite his leadership, and despite his faithfulness, there was an undeniable ache that would never leave him. His story is a reminder that even in our triumphs, we can experience profound pain. But in that pain, there is also a lesson about the cost of discipleship and obedience to God. Jesus himself warned us in Luke 14:27, "Whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple." Jefthah's cross was his promise, and it was one that he bore with dignity and reverence, despite the overwhelming sorrow it brought. His story challenges us to reflect on the promises we make to God and to carefully consider the impact they will have, not just on ourselves, but on those we love. While God honors our sacrifices, he also calls us to think deeply about the cost of our commitments, ensuring that we follow through with integrity and reverence. Final conflict with Ephraim. Even after his victorious battle against the Ammonites, Jefthah's struggles were far from over. The tribe of Ephraim, a powerful and influential group within Israel, confronted him in anger, accusing him of not having called them to participate in the fight against the Ammonites. Ephraim felt slighted and disrespected, believing that they, as a significant tribe, should have been included in the battle. Their pride and arrogance led them to accuse Jefthah of leadership failure, and they came to him with accusations, demanding answers. Jefthah, already burdened by the sacrifices he had made, found himself once again in the midst of conflict, this time with his own brothers, the people of Israel. The emotional weight of this accusation must have been overwhelming. After all, he had just led them to victory. Yet, instead of celebrating, Ephraim sought to challenge his authority. Jefthah's response to the tribe of Ephraim was a powerful example of both leadership and the protection of his honor. He didn't respond with violence or anger, but rather with a calm, measured explanation. He reminded them of the rejection he had faced from them when he was in exile, and how, in his time of need, they had not come to his aid. It was only when the Ammonite threat was so severe that they saw him as their last hope that they came seeking his leadership. Jefthah made it clear that the people of Gilead had stood by him when no one else would. In his words, we can hear the frustration of a man who had been rejected, used, and misunderstood. He had fought for them, but now, after his victory, they were challenging his right to lead. This encounter underscores the painful reality of leadership, that sometimes even those you fight for will turn against you. The story of Jefthah's conflict with Ephraim reminds us of the fragile nature of human relationships and the pride that often gets in the way of true unity. Ephraim's accusations came from a place of self-righteousness, and they failed to see the bigger picture. In many ways, their confrontation with Jephthah is a reflection of how we, as believers, sometimes fall into the trap of pride, forgetting the sacrifices and struggles of others. Proverbs 16:18 warns, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." Ephraim's pride blinded them to the truth, and it led to further division among the tribes of Israel. This conflict would not be easily resolved, and it serves as a poignant reminder that even after great victories, our relationships with others can be strained by pride, misunderstandings, and ungratefulness. It's a call for us to examine our own hearts and ensure that we are not allowing pride to cloud our judgment and create division. As Jephthah faced this final conflict, he once again found himself in battle. But this time, the fight was not against an external enemy. It was against his own people, those who should have supported him and recognized the cost of his sacrifices. It reminds us of the challenges that often arise when we stand firm in our faith and calling, even among those who should understand our struggles. The Bible tells us in Matthew 10:36, "A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." Sometimes the greatest battles are not fought on the outside, but within our own relationships. Jephtah's struggle with Ephraim is a stark reminder of the importance of humility and gratitude in our interactions with others, especially when we are faced with the temptation of pride and resentment. Now that you've seen how Jephtah's journey teaches us about overcoming rejection and discovering God's true purpose for our lives, I want to know, how have you experienced God's transforming power in your own life? Share your thoughts or experiences in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. If this message spoke to you, don't forget to subscribe and activate the notifications so you never miss another life-changing video. Your faith journey is just getting started, and I want to walk with you every step of the way. And hey, don't go just yet. Click on the next video that will pop up on your screen. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. See you there.